Uh, well, the previous demonstrations showed how easy it is when you're talking about most of the cyber area. Fortunately for the defense forces, these are not usually the issues that defense forces need to worry about. I've focused my recent research, several years of my recent research, on things that address national security in the proper sense, on protection versus foreign state-sponsored threats. And I will want to discuss about two things. Our armed forces in cyber do not perform the most basic things that they should perform, and they do perform in other fields. First of all, unlike, let's say, airspace, we don't know. Our forces, I mean, by the way, not any particular country, but every country, including the United States, Israel, Norway, and so on. We don't know what goes on in national cyberspace. We don't have this radar that scans the sky and understands what's happening. And more importantly, the armed forces do not protect from foreign threats actors currently. Now, I will go briefly through the foundations, the cyber. I would like to refer it as not as a domain, but as a substrate, as following the definition of Dr. Chris Demchak from US Naval War College. It's something that cross-cuts other areas of activity. It's not a siloed domain. Then I will go about the challenges and how they operate, and finally, to the most important part, to the defense adaptation, what is happening and what needs to be done. Now, the fact that cyber is a risk, it's pretty clear. I think the awareness is not lacking. The recent World Economic Forum report includes cyber attacks, but what I pointed here, that at least two other threats that they included in the top 5 can also be the result of cyber attacks. Failure of financial mechanisms is relatively conceivable. It's definitely a central threat for banks and national banks. And failure of national governance as a result of all sorts of cyber-instigated incidents. Now, what we need to remember that we can use cyber to achieve power throughout the spectrum of power. Okay? It's easy to see, again, when you're dealing with military, we usually think about hard power, how we can command, curse, threat, destroy things, but also the softer sides of power. And I came up with this sort of spectrum. I will demonstrate how it plays out. And it's important to remember because the adversaries start to understand that they can achieve their results operating in types of power that are not necessarily destructive and do not necessarily trigger a military response. Now, why did I put going forward to the adversaries? Why did I pick Russia? As an example, I'm not following the American trend. You know, if you look at the American threat assessments, China has been replaced by Russia now, but it's for a different reason, because of more personal interest, so to speak. Israel, for a long time, always definitely wanted to be more like Norway, right? Advanced and developed society, and so on. And we partially got what we wanted for. We now have a common border with Russia, so that's an achievement. To put it in context, this is the Golan Heights, which Israel controls. This is the Syrian Golan Heights. There are some 20-something different organizations have been fighting here in this area alone. And now we have, first of all, have a lot of Russian bases going on. And on top of that, we have all sorts of Iranian presence building up in this area. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out in the following years. One thing for certain, we need to understand that we now have a common border with Russia for the foreseeable future in decades and so on. So it will be very interesting to see, because up to several years ago, Russia was not in the top 10, in the top 20 threat scenarios that Israel had to consider. Now the situation is different, therefore we pay much more intense attention to what Russians want, what they're trying to do, and so on. So what do they want? They are pretty much consistent. When they're looking at the Russian threat assessment, they see all sorts of pretty much everything they see is the West trying to ruin Great Russia. Okay, I don't know why, but this is pretty much clear when you talk to these people, and they are pretty intelligent people. Since I was born in Moscow, I speak Russian, so it's easier for me to read and speak with them. Unfortunately, they only see conspiracies by the West. This is one graphic example of 24 color revolutions that they counted only since 89. Okay, they say this is a new model of Western warfare, the way that they achieve their goals. So it starts in 89, something in China, Czechoslovakia, so on, and this one ends in 2014 with Ukraine, of course, and then Hong Kong. The failed, as I view it, this is a failed Western example, attempt to create a color revolution, a sort of spontaneous internal revolt overthrowing the existing regime. This is the main threat scenario. Syria and Arab Spring is a most clear example in their view of this, again, type of modern warfare. And this is what they try to think of. They have a vast number of publications on this. These books are not only professional, so to speak, but they often become relatively selling well to the general audience. So all sorts of part conspirational, part scientific writing on the ways that information warfare works and the ways that the West is using it. So that is the main threat scenario. It has been consistent. They have been explicit about it. As the regimes fell apart in Egypt and so on, Medvedev, the then president, said that they have prepared the same thing for us. This is our main threat scenario. We need to do something about it. They being the West being the United States, Britain, whatever you want. Everything can be the West in this threat scenario. And then, if you remember, in the end of 2011, there was an election, early 2012, relatively surprising protests by middle-class, relatively well-off Russian citizens that were protesting against the expected victory of Putin for the next stage. And they were able to overcome these protests relatively easily, and they, in my view, they gained confidence, okay? So they see more and more proof in everything that they are correct in their threat assessment. These are flyers, according to the Russian publications, same flyers distributed in Cairo and in Kiev to guide the protesters, to organize the protests, to instigate, and so on. There has to be some sort of hidden hand behind it, probably the Western. So this is the threat scenario. But they've been able to keep their regime, and I think this is a crucial point at which they really gained a lot of confidence after difficult periods of confusion. And it's important to see the famous Gerasimov doctrine as not as a plan of what they want to do, but as a reflection of their understanding of the world. So this is something. This point that political goals are being achieved by means that are not necessarily military, with the famous doctrine, this is not something necessarily that they say we will do, but this is say, okay, now we understand how it works. They were also confident enough to publish it in a public way. We understand how it works, and because we understand how it works, we will be able to find ways to play according to these new rules of the game. So, couple of examples of how they work, how they operate. One is to the softer side of the spectrum of power. It's the Lisa case in Germany. How many are familiar with that? Okay. So there was an interesting case in Germany that was a model. NATO declared it's like a model case of influence operation of Russia. You try to leverage the new media landscape to get information on the targets and to target your messages. Then you create messages to influence public opinion, of course using your own traditional media and influencing foreign traditional media to cover the same aspects, set the agenda, and hopefully you will lead to political action and political results that you're trying to achieve. In this case, it was an interesting case. There was a real case this time. There was a girl of Russian origins in Berlin. There's a big community of ex-Russians in Berlin. She disappeared. She didn't return from school. People started looking for her, and she then returned after some 30 hours home. In the meantime, the police investigated and came to the conclusion that there was no kidnapping and things like this. It was some teenage thing, right? But the Russians were able to set the agenda, to use this case, spin it through the media, set the agenda in Germany and much of the West for over 3 weeks. And another thing that's important to say, so what happened is basically they used this case after a couple of days, ran a news story on Russian TV, which was pretty much clear what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that there's a Russian girl of Russian citizenship that has been kidnapped by supposedly migrants, okay, connecting to the German policy of accepting migrants. She was sexually abused, and the authorities cover up because it's not politically correct to adopt the story. Touching in a very, not very gentle way, the most sensitive issue in the German politics at the time, and it worked for them. They were able to set the agenda for over 3 weeks. Another thing you want to understand, that perhaps people notice less, is that this case demonstrated already then, it is several years ago, it's 20, it came in a very good context that demonstrates high operational maturity. The case happened in 11th January 2016. Less than 2 weeks later, there were very unpleasant events and New Year's celebrations that possibly organized mob assaulted many women that came to celebrate. And for some reason, the German media didn't cover it in the same days. It only covered it after a couple of days later. So I think this demonstrates operational maturity. They were able to identify fertile ground, and within several days, find a real case, okay, not an invented case, and design the whole information operation in the right context, rapidly, and you would not say that it was very sophisticated, but it definitely played out well there because they were able to set the agenda, political agenda throughout Germany and affected many NATO countries for 3 weeks or so, and it's still considered a very successful case. Now, on the other side of the spectrum is direct attack of Homeland infrastructure. This is something that definitely, I think, one of the main reasons we have defense forces is to prevent the adversaries to reach in the homeland, right? Okay, now with cyber we have at least the potential that has been demonstrated several times that the adversaries can reach the homeland targets, disrupt them, and if even physically destroy them without meeting any sorts of defense in the way. Okay, no border patrols, no airplanes, no defenders, and so on. So in this this experiment, so to speak, was in Ukraine in late December 2015. They've been able to create a physical result in the sense of blackout, stopping power delivery to almost 250,000 customers by purely cyber means. Okay? No kinetic attack at all, no little green man, no one on the ground. Interesting to see also for me that the areas that they targeted were two in the west, the capital area, Kiev, and somehow near capital. So, okay, so somehow it didn't happen in these areas. I don't know if it says something, but it's also interesting to see. So there was a relatively sophisticated cyber attack using the means similar to those that demonstrated just in this previous demonstrations to get access to the system. And then more sophisticated things that caused not only the disruption of power, but prevention of possibility to remotely restore the power supply. For example, using the links, the control links to transformation stations, remote stations. They use them to rewrite firmware on serial to Ethernet converters, therefore rendering remote control impossible. We know of this, by the way, because the Ukrainians asked the Americans to come and investigate the case, and as Americans usually do, they did a very solid job. People from who are really experts in this field, and they published a very detailed report, a very good one in the sense that it's based on facts and it can be proven. It's not just usual industry reports on what can be done, but it's something that they investigate on the ground. So we can see that there is good reason that Russian operations in cyber are considered a serious threat. Now, what can we do about it? I think if we're talking about warfare, okay, with traditional political goals, warfare operated perhaps below the threshold that we used to, but still it is warfare in the sense that it tries to achieve political objectives, something that is adversarial, okay? Their political objectives are very different from your political objectives, so it's sort of, you can call it warfare, okay? We're not going into the semantical discussion too much. And when you have still a state-based system, when one state tries to achieve its political objectives at the expense of your state, then it is the role for defense forces to protect. This is pretty clear, and clearly we need to do a lot of adaptations to meet these requirements, okay? Now, this is the situation in Israel, okay? I'm not saying that we have the better approach than others. I think everyone is trying to experiment. Some are waiting for others, some are already trying. So the national arrangement is like this. We have a new authority, new organizations, civilian organizations, non-defense organizations reporting to the Prime Minister, charged with creating policy and capabilities and doing operations to protect the civilian society. What's missing in this list of participants? Defense forces are nowhere here. Okay? Defense forces are doing their own thing. They're protecting themselves to maintain their necessary capabilities, of course, but there are like at least two parallel efforts. One is to better protect the entire civilian society and the critical infrastructure, and the other is the defense sector and the defense industrial base. So if you look at this from a very high level perspective, we have a situation that the state doesn't use the main capabilities that it has, the defense sector, in order to protect from the cyber threat. I've done similar research about several other countries. In the US, it's way too complicated to analyze here, but I think the bottom line is similar, okay? The DHS is charged with supporting the efforts of the private sector or something like this, but this is a very unique situation. Think of it. Let's say you have a new type of threat, air threat, airborne, and you say, well, you are the factory that produces something important. We can explain you that the threat is big. We can explain you some things to improve your protection, okay? Build a thicker roof, I don't know, or put it underground. But it's a shared responsibility at best, okay? It's your responsibility as a company to protect, and some responsibility from the government, of course, and so on. In Israel, it's a bit different. The state takes more responsibility in the sense that since 2003, the state had decided that organizations that are designated as critical infrastructure operations, they receive mandatory guidance from the security services on what to do regarding critical IT protection in the organization. And still, the responsibility is not on the state, but at least the state gives them some sort of services that they cannot procure on the market. New capabilities, intelligence, and so on. So still, it's way off from what you will ideally would expect, defense services protecting the society. Now, this is not a new situation in warfare. Warfare always have changed. Always adversaries came up with new ways and new capabilities, which triggered defense adaptation, and this is the field that is relatively developed in security studies. How do organizations innovate and adapt? And more importantly, why they don't do it as fast as you would expect or as efficiently. So it's like a relatively straightforward process. You have a combination of new technologies and new challenges that create some sort of technological breakthrough, result with a new device or system. That's the easiest part to see. This is something that we are way past it in cyber. We have been doing this for a couple of decades, and if you look in the American defense thinking, Since the mid-70s, there have been a lot of discussion of these things. Then, once you have these systems, then you start, ideally, you start to think what to do with them. You need to develop new ideas how to achieve your goals. You need to integrate these new devices and new gadgets into a bigger picture, into a system. Something that's less tangible is doctrine and force structure changes, okay, which is not as easy to see as technology. And eventually, the ultimate test is used in combat, okay? Without that, it's all hypothesis. We don't know how it will play out, but we expect it to be better than this, and so on. Without this, it's too early to say which is the right way. Fortunately, we haven't seen too much of cyber warfare used in combat in the sense that it is the main tool, okay? Not a supporting element of Air Force, so to speak, but this is the main tool. We haven't seen much of that. However, I think if we are not going to defend ourselves better, we will see it and we will be on the receiving side, okay? This is clearly not the desired result for us. This is why it's important to start paying more attention to what sorts of defense adaptations are going on and what can we do to improve them. Now, we do have reached great results. I mean, we as the West, okay? This is a culmination of very interesting efforts in the cyber field, so to speak, computing software, sensors, all of that, and the fusion of them. Of course, in the materials and engineering and so on. So adaptation is going on. We're not saying that militaries are ignoring the capabilities, ignoring the potential, ignoring the threat. However, the direction of the adaptation may be not best aligned to the ways that the adversaries are going to use the same capabilities. Now, so let's think of it even more conceptually, okay? We have a threat, okay? I think it's quite clear that people realize in the West that cyber is a new threat, not quite clear how it will play out, but it's there. Awareness is not a problem. By the way, if we remember the previous presentation about the GDP and the potential and so on, budgets and resources are also not a problem. It's a matter of decision and planning and committing the resources, what to do about the threat. So conceptually, there can be several things. Perimeter defense, this unfortunately we've been doing quite a long time. IT security industry likes to say all the time that perimeter defense is not good. It's always been breached and it's not good, but still we're doing it. So network segmentation, firewalls, all of these things are perimeter defense. On the national level, we do not have borders in cyberspace, not because it's technically impossible. It's relatively possible, but it brings out the more important political question about the values and the balance between human rights and basic freedoms and security needs and so on. So we don't have this on a national level, we have this on an organizational level. More interesting stuff is technological innovation. This is something quite also, if you look at the amount of technological research, which is done predominantly by, driven by defense funds in the United States and similar countries, there's vast number of technological innovations that people try to come through to find, but I don't see them integrated better into the defense sector, okay? They're definitely out there in the market, in the IT security market, cybersecurity market, which is estimated today something like $90 billion a year. So that's all the time technological innovation. You go to these conferences, every quarter they have a new best product. So that's happening, not really integrated still. And ideally, we would find out some really good strategic innovation that will render most of the adversaries' tools obsolete and irrelevant. This would be a good situation. Unfortunately, from what I've described in this short presentation, I'm seeing the opposite. I'm seeing that we have the potential. We are doing all sorts of defense adaptations, but the main threat, which enables a foreign state to directly reach the homeland targets in our state, is still not the focus of this adaptation. So this is something that is not a new phenomenon. Okay, we have seen this phenomenon over and over again in military history, in research of how nations and their defense organizations dealt with the change. Okay, and there's a lot of literature in military history and security studies, international relations that can be used to assist us to do more strategic thinking about cyber and the way to adapt our organizations to this defense. I hope that we will be able to use this more efficiently and faster. And on this, without this, we will have the situation that we have today. We may have, each of our countries, the best possible air force, the best possible land forces and naval forces, and the homeland is exposed to cyber attack. When, if and when the conflict will become escalated, we may find ourselves in a situation that the Air Force, land forces, and Navy will not have an enemy to fight. We will not be able to show their dominance because the enemy will be able to achieve their objectives and results faster, in a way that confuses our defense, and in a way that we will not be able to prevent them from reaching the homeland. So this situation that we have seen now, the possibility of direct attack has appeared and rises, and our defense forces are pretty much obsolete. What are the use of the tanks and the airplanes if you only can identify attack after it happened, and on top of that, you cannot really identify the attacker. You can identify the attack, you can identify the malware, you can identify with forensic research how it came into your system, but it's not as straightforward as saying who is behind it, who is the political actor who is behind it. So in these two situations, we have a lot of work to do. As of today, we have no idea what's going on currently in the national networks within the country. Okay, we can identify incidents here and there, we can identify malware, but we have no idea whether it is related to a bigger campaign, or is this malware that is now on this computer, it's this final destination, or it's just a stepping stone to something different. We have no idea. And of course, we don't prevent them to reach the target in the first place. So in order to end on a more pessimistic note, I would like to invite all of you to Tel Aviv, to our conference in June. And this is the conference at our research center, the Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center, Tel Aviv University hosts. It's free to attend. It draws several thousand people each year. This is a very interesting forum to discuss these issues from all sorts of perspectives. It's not a trade show, it's not a defense conference, it's not an academic conference, it's all of the above together during the week. I'm pretty sure that we'll still have time, okay? We'll have a couple of years to figure out this thing before it may be figured out for us. So I'm looking forward to the West in general and our partners countries in particular to do better in cyber defense using all the potential that we have, and the sooner the better. Thank you.